Hello people, welcome to another episode on Met Cancer, Metabolic, not genetic. In this video, you will hear from Den Stacey, his whole story from a recent interview with Drew Porritt. Remember, you can get me on X at Vincent Gledhill, and you can read many of Professor Seyfried's papers on our website, metcancer.com, along with Den Stacey's whole protocol. We also have a community forum at metcancer.com/forum. This is a half-hour video and well worth watching. A link to the full video, which is almost 3 hours long, is in the description. I give you Den Stacey.
My wife and I and our friends all really enjoy hiking. We live in Victoria, which is Vancouver Island in British Columbia, and there's all kinds of beautiful forests and hikes that we do on a regular basis. And I was noticing that the elevations were starting to get tougher. And on this particular day that we're referring to, well, it's actually 3 days in a row. We did 3 hikes in a row. And the first day, I had extraordinary chest pain, a very strange tightening feeling, breathlessness. And I thought, I don't know, maybe I'm just tired. We went back to another mountain the next day, and the same thing happened. And then Thanksgiving Day, this is October 2022, we were on a particularly difficult incline, and it just froze me in my tracks, and I had to go down. And then later that night at Thanksgiving dinner, I helped my mother move the table from one room to another and got the same level of breathlessness. So this is problematic. I immediately went to the hospital and explained this story to the doctors, who were alarmed and put me in a CT scanner that they had there. And what they thought they found was a pulmonary embolism, a blockage in the pulmonary artery, which isn't good. And immediately started to, mobilize a team of people to address this. This led to me being taken to another hospital and a cardiac care team. And it became clear fairly quickly that this wasn't a pulmonary pulmonary embolism. It was, in fact, some kind of massive tumor in my pulmonary artery. And the process began to figure out what to do. They were fairly certain that it was too late, that sometime within the next 24, 48 hours, I would die. The space that was left in my pulmonary artery for all of the blood that my body needed to do what it needed to do was down to about 1 millimeter. And they were surprised that I'd even made it in. And a process of exploration about what we might be able to do. At that time I was 49. I had 4 children, several of which were going to graduate in the spring. And my wife and I just sort of began exploring with them, what might we be able to do? Now it's also cancer. Now it's also metastasized to the right lung at a minimum that they can see in the scanners. And they were fairly certain that this wasn't going to go well. Luckily, this particular hospital in Canada had an interest in, and was the top cardiac surgery hospital, I think, in the country. And they had poached a couple of young doctors from out east who were trying to make a name for themselves with a new surgery that was, I think they were lovingly calling the pop and swap in our conversations, where they would be able to take and replace my pulmonary artery with another human pulmonary artery and pulmonic root. And they had never had a chance to do it. But I think the fact that I was terminal, that there wasn't a way out of this from their perspective, and that they were able to pull some strings and get the human donor tissue they needed, allowed me to, what they thought would be, buy some time. They thought, if we do this surgery, we'll clear up a little bit of room in your pulmonary artery. Worst case scenario, if that goes bad and it gets shredded during the surgery, we'll give you a new one. And that'll maybe get you to the spring, but this cancer you have is going to definitely kill you. So for them, it was this opportunity to do this new cool surgery that they wanted to prove out, which from our perspective gave us time to figure out what we would do next, not to die. And so they did that surgery. they said we had maybe a 30% chance of bleeding out on the table. We took that risk, thought, it's either die or die. So we'll take that risk. They did the surgery. It was successful. And that started us down the road. But during that, they obviously got a chance to take a biopsy of what this tumor was, which happened to be the size of a mandarin orange in my pulmonary artery. If anybody wants to see photos, they're on my blog. It's quite repulsive.
We'll put them on here.
Yeah, that's great.
We'll grab them. We'll
yeah.
While you're talking, we'll put them on the slideshow.
Awesome. And then they did this biopsy, and they were able to determine this is pulmonary artery intimal sarcoma, which is not good. This is a 1 in 80 million cancer, and it is fast moving, and it's universally lethal. At first, we thought maybe it was a different type of cancer, and maybe there would be some treatments that we'd be able to do that would address it. But after they got that biopsy, the oncologist was not optimistic.
In fact, I think that they had told you that you had maybe at most 6 to 8 months.
Yeah, they said if you don't do chemo and radiation, you'll be dead in 6 to 8 months. And if you choose to do, and you'll have a relatively pleasant standard of living during that period you can spend with your children, and you won't be sick and miserable. If you do the standard of care options that we're telling you, you may live 15 or 16 months, but they'll be very uncomfortable, sick months.
Going back to your story, and now with your family on board, you mentioned about the support of your wife, your children, especially your older son, saying, look, your situation's a little bit easier in a way, if I could say, because you're being given choices. There are no choices. What did you do from there, and how did the two of you connect?
I think, long story short, there was a deep dive into Seyfried's work, the published work, his book, which anybody that's going through this or is listening to this and is thinking, where do I begin? Pick up Seyfried's book, Cancer is a Metabolic Disease, and begin to meticulously study it, because everything you need to know about whether or not this is makes any sense, how to do it, all of the proofs, it's all there in glorious detail. So I started there. I went through the papers. I watched hours and hours of videos. So, let me just stop and say thank you for, doing interviews with Seyfried and everybody else that has, because for a lot of people, that's where they, find the door to this. And in your darker hours, when you're wondering, am I doing something that makes any sense at all? Going back to those videos and listening to him speak, and with the certainty that he states the things that he does, it's just really wonderful. But so we began diving into all of this. I was reading, paper after paper after paper, book after book, sometimes, several papers in a book in a day, because there's some sense of urgency too. When somebody puts a stopwatch on your life, you get focused.
There's no time for Netflix and shit.
No, that's right. That's right. So, that's what we began to do. And so you start to put together questions like, okay, well, I'm seeing here that I get we need to, lower glucose into a therapeutic range, but there's this murky bit of business here about inhibiting glutaminylysis and glutamine. And well, what are we going to do that? How is that done? You start to dig. And so I had some questions, and I wrote to Seyfried and I said, this is who I am. This is what's going on. I'm reading your stuff. What can you help me with? And he's very busy, and very much like the Howards, he's not taking people on as a doctor. He's not prescribing anything. So what you get back to tends to be a package of information, which gives you a kind of another 30,000 foot view of some specifics. And so we digested that. And then I got very specific with some questions, and I asked something about, I think, the difference in efficacy between oxoacetate and 6-deazo-5-oxoL-norleucine, or DON. And at that point, I think he just got sick of my emails and sent back an email that just said, call Daniel Orrego and a phone number. And so I did. And Daniel immediately picked up and said, what's going on? And I told him, and he said, you've reached the right place. Let's go.
So Dan, one of the things that people didn't get from the Dr. Seyfried interview that we did was they didn't get sort of, let's say we're at 30,000 feet above a view of like cancer as a metabolic disease, metabolic and mitochondria disease. You go a little bit further down and you're like, okay, what are you actually doing on this thing?
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm sure of course, you have to explain it to your kids, they see you. So before we go deeper into the weeds here and some of the, finer sort of tweaks and the ins and outs, how would you describe the protocol as you understood it to people around you who didn't come from a science background and hadn't read all of Seyfried's work?
Yeah, I think that the easiest way, without getting into the weeds at all, which these guys are much more qualified to do in a much more articulate way, is just to understand that what we now understand is that cancer has two fundamental fuel sources. Cancer ferments glucose and glutamine. And so just about anybody of any age, if you tell them this fact and say, well, what do you think we should do about it? Most of them will immediately say, well, why don't we take away those fuel sources? Everything that a cancer cell has to do, make cell membranes, divide, spread, everything that happens is entirely dependent on access to its fuel source. Energy metabolism drives every other part of that. And so, number one, you have to inhibit these two fuel sources. What are they? Well, they're glucose and they're glutamine. So the first part of the protocol is figuring out exactly how far you've got to lower glucose and exactly how often and how far you've got to limit glutamine to take away the two fuels that drive cancer growth, spread, metastasis, and everything that it wants to do every day.
And so I'll jump in. So a lot of people don't know the source of glutamine. Glutamine is your amino acid that makes your muscle. So we need glutamine.
Right. It's a healthy part of the body.
It's a healthy part of the body. So that's why Dennis is kind of a big guy. He's got a lot of muscle on him. So when we're inhibiting glutamine and glucose, you're going to lose some weight and you're also going to lose some muscle. So we can't really start with someone that's emaciated with no muscle. There's no place to go with that. So he was really, everything about his case was perfect for us. He hadn't had chemo radiation, so he wasn't all beat up. He had some weight and muscle that we could, wasn't going to hurt him to take that down a little bit. And so, he was perfect. And, but that's the fundamental, glucose and glutamine. And then everything else kind of stems from that.
Yeah. And to add to that, as Daniel's pointing out, by very carefully, meticulously measuring fat grams, protein grams, and carb grams, you can use food as a drug to manipulate metabolism such that your blood glucose drops into a therapeutic range, which is 55 to 65 mg/dL. But with glutamine, as you're pointing out, it's this very important thing. It's used in 121 processes in the body. Your immune system relies on it, which is a very important part of healing from cancer. Your gut biome and your GI tract rely on it. So it's not something that you can day after day, hour after hour inhibit. This is where the name press pulse comes from. We press on cancer by limiting access to glucose, and we do that in a sustained way, creating metabolic stress. And then we pulse in instances where at specific times and in specific ways and in combination with other parts of the protocol, like HPOT and the use of other substrates, we inhibit glutamine just for a few hours using whatever method we do. In my case, it was a drug called Dawn. And that allows you to safely remove glutamine from the equation for just long enough to create a problem for cancer.
Twice a day, you're checking in using a finger prick test to see, are you within range?
That's right. And I mean, when you're really getting into it and you're really trying to find your stride, I mean, sometimes you're going through 8 test strips a day. Like you're trying everything you can to really get a handle on how your body's responding and what you're doing and whether this type of food is having an impact on blood glucose. So eventually near the end, you can get away with 1 or 2, but I was testing quite a bit. Yeah.
And it's not just, Dr. Howard, it was not just the food component that plays in. A big part of Seyfried's protocol is also making sure that you significantly reduce the stress component in your life. Why is that so key?
Well, so Dennis, he told us something that we didn't know. Apparently, if you play some video game, you can raise your blood sugar 50 points and it'll stay there.
Yeah, it's a funny story.
It's a micro stressor. Your blood glucose goes up.
Well, Seyfried's protocol very specifically in that 2017 paper, it very specifically says, stress reduction, mindfulness, meditation, these are things that we know Seyfried, this isn't just an afterthought add-in. It's critical. It turns out that stress causes your body to produce cortisol, the stress hormone, and cortisol drives something called gluconeogenesis, which is the manufacturing of new sugar, new glucose in your liver. And so if you're not managing your stressors, that can be job stress or child stress or any manner of stressor, your body, if you get even a little bug or a little cold, you'll notice, especially when you're in these very rarefied ranges of blood glucose in the therapeutic range, you'll notice these sudden changes. And so Dr. Howard's actually referring to this very funny story where a friend of mine knew I was sort of at home, holed up, trying to heal, wasn't able to see people, and he thought he would be very helpful. Thank you very much, Jay. And went out and bought a PS5 so that we could play PS5 golf together. But it was a ruse. He really wanted to play this game called Warzone, which is this very aggressive, high-speed, high-octane game. And so I agreed that I would play around with him. And at the end of a few hours of this game, I went from my blood glucose at 62 to blood glucose at 120, where it stayed for almost an entire day. And this is just illustrative of the fact that external stresses drove blood glucose production in the liver just from a game. It's at these ranges where you're trying to maintain blood glucose, stress management is critical. So dealing with family stress, dealing with work colleague stress, dealing with child stress, dealing with anything that's going to upset that apple cart is critical.
Every so often, you're going and doing hyperbaric.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that.
Which is, it's phenomenally interesting. Not enough is said about HBOT in many different disease models, but in cancer, it's extraordinarily interesting. Daniel was mentioning a scientist earlier, Dom D'Agostino, who did some phenomenal work on this and was able to show with a probing electron microscope inside a hyperbaric oxygen chamber, glioblastoma cells tearing themselves apart because of reactive oxygen species at, I think, 2.5 to 2.8 atmospheres absolute. So when you get into a hyperbaric oxygen chamber,
a hard chamber. There's soft chambers, there's hard chambers.
Yeah, the soft chambers are, they're great for all kinds of things. They have their own benefit and their own use. But for cancer, when we're telling people to get HBOT therapy in conjunction with a pressed pulse, we need the hard chambers because they can go to these depths. And while you're in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber at depths above 2.2 to 2.8 atmospheres, what happens is reactive oxygen species act very much like radiation therapy does to tear up cancer cells. Radiation therapy is effectively knocking an electron off an oxygen molecule, and it's causing a dysregulated spin that flies around and tears up the cancer cell. Well, you're doing the same thing with oxygen, but radiation isn't preferentially targeting a cancer cell. It's doing that to every cell in the immediate vicinity. What we found is that hyperbaric oxygen, largely because the rest of the body has protection from the ketone bodies that are being burned in the cells, you get the same effect as radiation from reactive oxygen species generated in hyperbaric oxygen at those depths and pressures.
And how often are you going and in the protocol?
Yeah, Seyfried calls for going 5 days a week. It can be a little bit cost prohibitive. For me, I couldn't afford the time or the treasure to go 5 times a week, but we were able to figure out 3 times a week. And so for the entire duration of all the protocols, which we break up, so we have we probably did 4 protocols in total over 6 months. For the entire time, we'd be going three days a week, making sure that one of those days you've got your substrates on board, your blood glucose low, your dawn on board, and you're in hyperbarics. And that's a very powerful cancer killing moment.
Talk about the drugs for a second. Who wants to chat about the role that the various drugs to suppress?
It's an essential component, right? In fact, Dr. Seyfried characterizes it as a drug diet combination. Why is this? Well, as Dr. Howard and Dennis have already mentioned, using nutrition as a drug, right, carefully titrating your fat grams, protein grams, carb grams, so that you lower the threshold of available glucose to disease is one component. One cannot really do this with the glutamine side. So there's any number of novel substrates out there, such as, sodium phenylbutyrate, you mentioned oxaloacetate, even EGCG has, green tea extract has some mild effects in this regard. But it's really the 6-diazo-5-oxo-L-norleucine, otherwise colloquially known as DON, that has the most powerful effects. And this is a key component of the pulse side of the pressed pulse therapy, right? Glucose control is chronic, in other words, every day. And then at interval, one selectively lowers glutamine using the 6-diazo-5-oxo-L-norleucine. And what Dennis is mentioning is that this is where what Seyfried talks about in terms of dosing, timing, and scheduling is so important. So you get your glucose into that 55 to 65 milligrams per deciliter range, maybe 40 minutes or a few minutes before you go into the hyperbaric chamber, you dose the 6-diazo substrate, right? You may have also included other elements like mebendazole, or other substrates like berberine and metformin to further optimize glucose lowering. You enter the chamber with all of those elements of the press pulse protocol on board. And so that is I think a comprehensive summary of the level of precision that's required to extract these effects.
Who was the rest of the individuals that were there that were supporting you from a standard sort of medical side of things?
I guess one of the things I'd like to say is the whole team at Jubilee Hospital in Victoria, from the nurses, the physicians, everybody there was incredible. We developed a great bond with the whole team. They all worked tirelessly to try and do whatever they could to help me. BC Cancer has a huge facility right across the street from Jubilee Hospital, and that team works collaboratively. So I had an oncologist from there, and an internist, and a whole team of surgeons, and everyone there was phenomenal. I can't say enough about them. I owe them literally my life, and have developed some really great relationships with a lot of them. When it comes to the oncology side, great oncologist, nice fellow, but like many oncologists, his hands were completely tied in that he's bound by law to recommend and administer standard of care. And so in the exploration of this as an alternative, he had to sort of bow out. But we were able to maintain a relationship. We were able to continue to communicate. They continue to provide scans even to this day to follow the progress of what I'm doing. More recently, they've actually taken the protocol, my data, the HRF case study, they've added it to the file. And we've begun to have very interesting conversations around what's possible. But it's very difficult. And I think a lot of people watching who are in a similar situation that I was are going to have to figure out how to navigate their oncologist and the medical community, because this is not part of the standard of care. It's something that they can lose their license if they recommend. And so your team becomes people that are brave enough to put themselves out, like HRF and Dr. Howard and Daniel. Of course, if you're as lucky as I am to have a wife like I do, who's incredibly gifted at the pragmatic organization of the things that it takes that you have to do every day, the things you have to eat, the drugs you need to take, where you need to be. And of course, all the family and friends that are going to be there to support you financially and emotionally. And it takes a whole village.
They came back and they shared something, which was, I don't know how this is happening.
Absolutely.
I don't know why this is working, but I guess whatever you're doing, keep on
going.
doing it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. We organized very quickly the first the first protocol, and when I say I did 4 protocols, I really mean there's the constant press of glucose inhibition, but we pulse these 21-day cycles of dawn and hyperbarics very aggressively. And so each one of those we sort of count as a protocol. So after the first 21-day protocol that was performed that December 2022, I went about 3 weeks later after I'd finished that to get a CT scan, just to sort of follow up, because we'd been kicking the can of chemotherapy and radiation down the road, not telling the oncology team we're not going to do it, just saying maybe we'll do it later, because you can also get fired by your oncology team for making certain types of decisions. So and that allowed us to continue to get the CT scans and the follow-ups and any help we might need. And so we did one of those first follow-on scans, and the result was that there was no reperfusion in the heart, and the stage 4 metastasis that they saw in the lung and the metastasis that they were seeing in the lymph nodes had been reduced by 50%. And that's in 4.5 or 5 weeks of glucose inhibition and dawn administration with HBOT.
That's pretty quick.
Well, what's interesting about that, and it goes back to why you stack all of these things around HBOT. It does happen very quickly. We're talking about impugning energy viability in a cell. If you were to hold my head underwater, how many minutes would it take for me to die? Literally 3 or 4, maybe, depending on how long I can hold my breath, but very quickly, because you've taken my cell's ability to use oxygen as energy away. Well, this is how quickly your cancer will die when you're taking those fermentable fuel sources away, in minutes. And so 2.5 hours in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber where you've turned off glutaminolysis and you've turned off access to glucose, and you're further stressing this with mebendazole or any of the other substrates you may be using, is killing those cancers. And in the same way, when you pull my head out of the water, I'm not rescued suddenly by exposure to oxygen. So very quickly, you can devastate cancer, even in just the few hours that you're in hyperbaric oxygen. And so it was surprising then, absolutely. I think we probably broke into tears in the car after the oncology. We were on our way to hyperbaric oxygen when the oncologist called us. But now we understand it can happen very quickly. You have to do it at an extraordinarily Olympic level. You have to be extremely consistent. You have to change everything. But when you do, it works like a hot damn.
Dan, you shared that was the results of the first scan as a follow-up.
Right.
Right. And you did total 4 of those.
So yeah, before we got to a place where, that's actually pretty interesting. At the end of the 4th, we did another scan, and what we saw was that there was a tiny amount of visible tumor just above the reference range in the right lung left. They weren't really able to see anything anywhere else, but still, that's something that's there. And at this point, months down the road, working with Daniel, I'd become fairly confident in the press pulse protocol. I was watching it work, protocol after protocol. I was feeling better. I had, as Dr. Howard had pointed out, I'd eliminated pre-diabetes. I'd lost 70 pounds. I was aging in reverse. I was getting incredibly healthy. I felt great, and I knew this worked. I just knew it. And so at that point, I'd done some research, and it was very likely that what was visible just above the reference range was scar tissue. But I was also prepared for the idea that it wasn't, and that I may have to do another press pulse protocol. But I made the decision at that point to sort of take my foot off of the gas from a extreme. I started eating ketogenically, but more normally. I didn't go to hyperbaric oxygen. I stopped with the mebendazole. I didn't do the dawn. I just took my foot off the gas, because what I wanted to know is, if I have to do this for the rest of my life, which it wasn't clear whether or not I would, I wanted to know, how was my cancer going to behave? How quickly would it come back? And I knew I had a PET CT scan scheduled for 90 days from the date of this scan. So I just stopped doing what I was doing, knowing that I was accepting perhaps this was going to return and we'd have to go again. But I needed to know for myself, how quickly would my cancer respond? How quickly would it come back? Where would it go? How would it grow? And so I stopped and grit my teeth and went through this process so that I'd have more data to set the rest of my life up with. I'd know how I needed to behave. I went into that final PET CT scan 90 days later, which was July of 2023. And I went in, and whatever was in my lung had been effectively consumed by autophagy in my body. And they could find no cancer in the lymph nodes, none in the bone, no reperfusion in the heart. I was effectively NED. All the cancer was gone. They couldn't find it, which has now further been shown to be true again in another follow-up CT scan just a few months ago. So yeah, it's an interesting process to go through, and it'll take as long as it takes anybody to go through, depending on their level of intensity and commitment and their disease burden, really.
First, of course, acknowledging your story. You know, Dan, when I had heard about all this and further had conversations with Daniel and getting a chance to, you know, look at this case study and walk through it, which we'll link to inside of the show notes, just feeling, you know, so much, you know, joy for you, for your family,
Thank
for
you.
your kids. You
Yeah,
know,
it's
I don't have
exciting.
kids, but just imagining myself in that situation. And then also excitement for the larger community that's there, that, hey, this is another brick that's being laid of an example of somebody successfully following the Seyfried protocol.
Right.
And being honest about how hard and difficult it is, not sugarcoating it, not telling people that this is some sort of, you know, silver bullet that's out there, but that it takes meticulous work and it takes a supportive team. And that at least that will help a few people who are on the fence of trying to understand, should they do this? Should they not do this? Should they work with people? Are there other options on the table? That at least they feel like there's more information for them to make an informed decision.
Sure.
Right?
You know, one of the things that I think is really important is we hear a lot about alternative approaches to cancer management or cancer treatment that have these miraculous outcomes. But one of the things that seems to be shared in most of these stories is no real idea about why we had this miraculous remission or this positive outcome. In this case, what happened in my body was exactly what was described in Seyfried's science. There's no misunderstanding. There's no question about why I got this result. And that, I think, is probably more exciting than the result itself. That you can look to the scientific literature, you can see what the experiments in animals show, you can see 100 years of science that very clearly points to what will happen in your body if you do this, this, and this. That's more exciting than the fact that it worked. I mean, it's exciting that it worked, but that we know exactly why and that it can be relied upon to happen in just about anybody. I think that's remarkable.
Is there a message that you want to leave some of the audience members who are trying to avoid being in this situation in the first place, just from everything that you've come across, your own reading,
Sure.
and your familiarity with Seyfried's work? So this is for people who are trying to avoid cancer in the future.
Yeah, I think one of the doctors, Howard, mentioned this earlier. We now know that the science is fairly definitive. It's clear. Cancer is it's a problem of mitochondrial function. And so if you poison your mitochondria in a number of ways that you can, by over-consuming fructose or over-consuming alcohol, or allowing yourself to get overweight, or eating a high carbohydrate diet, not protecting your mitochondria, you're putting yourself at risk. You can look at the other side of that coin, which is what I'm going to recommend, which is protect your mitochondria. Do things to improve the size, the efficiency, and the number of mitochondria you have. And there are any number of things to do that. Cold water exposure, hyperbaric oxygen, phospholipids, any number of things you can do. It's easy to find.
Resistance training
Resistance
probably has
training.
the most amount of literature
I think you're absolutely
around
right.
its protective
Yeah.
aspect of cancer.
And so protect your mitochondria, build your mitochondria. If that was your primary focus, I think you could feel fairly confident that you'd be as prophylactically protected as you could be.